The organ was playing when she walked in. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her husband had told her to stay home. You're exhausted, sweetheart. You're 7 months pregnant. You don't need to put yourself through this. She believed him. She almost stayed home, but then her best friend called, and something in the silence
so
before
sorry,
the
Caroline.
first
I
word
had to
told her
show you
everything.
this.
So she drove 40 minutes, changed her route 3 times,
Who is she,
walked through
Mark?
the heavy
This
wooden
confirms
doors
his
of St.
intent.
Clement's
Are you
Episcopal
absolutely
Church
sure
in a
you
black
want to
dress
proceed?
she couldn't
Yes.
fully button, and there he was,
I have to do
standing
this for my
beside his
baby.
first wife's casket at his first wife's funeral, laughing, not a polite smile, not a quiet moment between two colleagues, laughing, head back, hand on her arm. The laugh of a man who had just heard the best news of his life. His pregnant wife stood in the back of the church and watched, and no one turned around. What she discovered in the weeks that followed would change everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her husband, and herself. But the most powerful revelation didn't come from what he did. It came from a dead woman who had been quietly preparing for this moment for years. This is the story of Caroline Ashworth. And the title her husband thought applied to someone else. Stay with us. Lesson statement. Because sometimes the woman who walks into the room at the worst possible moment is the one who finally starts seeing clearly. And sometimes losing everything you thought you had is the only way to find out what was actually yours all along. Meaning plus value. This story is for every woman who has ever explained away a feeling that turned out to be right. For everyone who stayed too long, doubted themselves too much, or made themselves smaller to fit inside someone else's life. Caroline's journey is not just about betrayal. It is about the quiet, powerful act of choosing yourself even when everything around you is falling apart, even when the timing is terrible, even when you are 7 months pregnant and standing in the back of a church in a dress you couldn't button. If this story makes you feel seen, you are exactly who it was made for. If Caroline's story moved you, if any moment felt like something you have lived or something someone you love has lived, let us know in the comments below. Your words matter more than you know. Hit the like button if you stayed until the end. It tells us this kind of storytelling is worth continuing. Share this with one person who needs to hear it today. You don't have to explain why. They will know. And if you are new here, subscribe and stay. We tell stories about real human strength every single week. Stories that remind you who you are. We will see you in the next one.
The organ played something slow and low. Caroline heard it before she opened the heavy wooden door. A single note, held too long, like someone pressing a bruise to see if it still hurt. She stood on the stone steps of St. Clement's Episcopal Church, with one hand on the door handle and the other pressed flat against her stomach. 7 months. The baby was sitting high today, pressing up under her ribs in a way that made it hard to take a full breath. Or maybe that was just the morning. Maybe that was just the 40-minute drive she had taken after deciding 3 separate times to turn around and go home. Elliot had told her not to come. He had said it easily. That was the thing she kept returning to, even now. Even standing on these steps in a black dress, she could no longer fully button. He had said it the way you say something, when you have already decided, and you are simply informing the other person of your conclusion. You don't need to put yourself through that, sweetheart. You're exhausted. Stay home. She had believed him. She had actually believed him. She had been sitting on the edge of the bed in her robe, watching him knot his tie in the mirror, and she had thought, he is right. I am tired. I will stay home and rest. And he will come back this evening and tell me how it went. And then Sylvie had called. Caroline? Sylvie's voice had been very careful. That was how she knew immediately. Sylvie Monroe was never careful. Please tell me you're already there. I'm at home, Caroline had said. Elliot thought it would be better if I... Caroline. Still careful, still that particular flatness. I'm driving past the church right now. I can see Elliot through the window, and he is most definitely not grieving. She had not asked what that meant. She had already known, somehow, what that meant. She had gotten dressed in 12 minutes. She had driven 40 minutes. She had changed routes 3 times. And now she was standing on the steps of St. Clement's Episcopal Church, At 10:15 in the morning, and the organ was playing something slow and low, and she was pressing her hand against her stomach as if that would steady anything at all. She opened the door and stepped inside. The church was full. 60, maybe 70 people, arranged in dark clothing, across pale wooden pews. The smell hit her first, lilies and candle wax and something older, something that belonged to the stone walls themselves. The light came in through tall, narrow windows and fell in long, pale rectangles across the floor. She stood in the doorway, and her eyes moved automatically to the front of the room. Elliot was not at the podium. The service had not yet begun. He was standing near the front of the church, close to the closed casket with its arrangement of white roses, and he was standing beside Pamela Voss. Pamela Voss, Vice President of Strategy at Ashworth Industries, tall, impeccably dressed in a black suit that somehow managed to look expensive rather than somber. Dark hair pulled back, the posture of a woman who had decided long ago exactly where she belonged in any room she entered. Elliot was laughing. Not a polite, pressed-down smile, not a quiet moment of professional levity between two colleagues enduring a long day. He was laughing, head tilted back slightly, one hand resting on Pamela's arm. His shoulders loose in the way they only were when he was genuinely relaxed. The laugh of a man who had just heard very good news. Carolyn stood in the doorway of the church and watched her husband laugh at his first wife's funeral, while his 7 months pregnant wife stood in the back and no one turned around to see her. The usher materialized at her elbow, a young man in a dark suit, probably 22, looking at her with professional concern. "Ma'am, can I help you find a seat?" "Yes," she said. Her voice came out normally. She was surprised by that. "Back row, please." She followed him to the last pew and sat down. The wood was hard and cool. She straightened her dress over her stomach. The usher offered a program, and she took it without looking down. Her eyes stayed on the back of Elliot's head. She watched the easy angle of his shoulders. She watched his hand leave Pamela's arm and then return to it briefly. A gesture so natural, it had obviously happened many times before. She watched Pamela say something and Elliot tilt his head slightly to listen. A small, intimate tilt, the kind you only develop with someone whose voice you know well. This is what disbelief actually feels like, she thought. Not dramatic, not loud, just very, very still. The organ shifted into something more formal. The gathered crowd moved and settled. Elliot took his seat in the front pew, and beside him, stiff-shouldered and red-eyed, sat Thomas, Elliot's son, Meg's son. 26 years old and looking younger today, the way grief does to people. He sat as far to the right of his father as the pew allowed. Pamela settled into the second row. She settled there with the ease of someone who had decided in advance where she would sit, had not consulted anyone about it, and was entirely comfortable with her choice. The second row, Caroline thought, not the third, not respectfully back. The second row. She checked her phone. She did not know why. Force of habit, lock, unlock. The screen showed no messages. Elliot had not texted to ask how she was feeling. He had not texted to ask if she had stayed home, as he suggested. Lock again. The minister began to speak about Margaret Ashworth. He talked about her charity work, her 3 decades as a figure in this community, her love of roses, and her insistence on remembering every person's birthday without a calendar. Her grace, the minister said, and her humor and her absolute commitment to the people she loved. Caroline listened and looked at the program in her hands. Margaret Eleanor Ashworth, born 1952, died this past January. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed 2 years ago. Elliot sat in the front row with his hands folded. He looked appropriately solemn now. He had turned it on like a switch. Caroline watched him turn it on and felt something move inside her chest. Not a revelation, not a dramatic shift, just a small, cold sliding sensation, like a drawer closing that had always been left open. She had known this man for 4 years. She had married him 2.5 years ago. She was carrying his child. She had rearranged her entire life around his schedule and his preferences and his moods, and he had told her not to come today, and she had believed him, and she was sitting in the back row at his first wife's funeral in a dress she could not fully button, watching him be someone she did not recognize. Thomas walked to the podium to speak about his mother. He was young and undone, and he gripped the sides of the podium with both hands while he found his footing. He talked about his mother's garden. He talked about the way she made tea every morning in the same blue pot. He talked about how she never once made him feel like being loved by her was something he had to earn. His voice broke once. He steadied it. He was almost finished when he glanced back across the church, the instinctive scan of someone looking for familiar faces. And his eyes found Caroline in the last pew. He stopped. For just a moment, Thomas Ashworth stopped speaking and looked at her. Something moved across his face that she could not name. Then his eyes moved to the second row, where Pamela sat with her hands folded in her lap. Back to Caroline. His jaw tightened. He looked back at his notes. He knows, Caroline thought. The organ played again. Someone near the front began to cry with the soft, helpless sound of genuine grief. Caroline sat in the back row and listened and held the program in her hands and did not cry at all. She stayed very, very still. The reception was held at the Ashworth estate. This struck about Caroline, now with a clarity she had not felt when she arranged it. Meg had lived in this house for 31 years. Her furniture was still here. Her roses were dormant in the winter garden. Her reading glasses were probably still folded on the nightstand of the guest room downstairs, where she had spent her final months when the stairs became too much. And Elliot was holding her post-funeral reception in the house she had built. 3 weeks ago, Elliot had asked Caroline to handle the catering. "You're so good at these things," he had said. She had spent an afternoon choosing between past hors d'oeuvres and finger sandwiches, deciding on white flowers, composing the guest list. She had done all of this carefully and thoughtfully because she believed it mattered, because she believed she was helping. She stood now near the fireplace with a glass of sparkling water and understood for the first time the full architecture of what she had been doing. She had been the wife who handled things. The capable, pleasant, undemanding second wife who took the calls and arranged the flowers and made the lists and never once asked uncomfortable questions. She watched Elliot move through the room. This was what he did. She had always admired it, the ease of it, the way he moved from person to person, as if their attention was simply his due, and he was generously distributing his own in return. A touch on the arm. A warm word. The practiced laugh, surfacing and receding on schedule. The practiced laugh. She could see it now the way you can see the seams in something once they have been pointed out. Once you know they are there, you cannot stop seeing them. Pamela Voss stood on the far side of the room, speaking with 2 board members Caroline recognized from company dinners. She was composed and attentive and had not looked in Caroline's direction once. Not at the church, not in the car park, not here. She is very good, Caroline thought. She has had practice at this. Elliot found his way to her side eventually. He put his arm around her. He kissed her temple, and he smelled like his usual cologne, the one she had always loved, the one she had bought him for his last birthday. And she stood very carefully, inside the circle of his arm and did not respond to any of it. "You came?" he said. "I came," she said. "You should be resting." "I'm fine." Someone passed with a tray of small plates. Elliot took one without looking at it. He was performing attentive husband. She recognized the performance now with a precision that made her feel slightly sick. "Sylvie called me," Caroline said. Something moved across Elliot's face. It was very fast, gone before she could properly name it. And then the smile came, but not the right kind of smile. The smile he used when something had surprised him, and he needed 3 seconds to compose his response. She had seen that smile before, she realized. She had seen it many times. She had simply never understood what it meant. "How many times has he used that smile on me?" she thought. "She worries too much," Elliot said pleasantly. "She said you seem to be holding up well. It's a difficult day. You manage the way you manage." Caroline looked at him. He looked back at her with warm, steady eyes, and she realized that she had absolutely no idea what was happening behind those eyes. She had been married to this man for 2.5 years, and she had believed she knew him, and she had no idea. She had never had that thought before, not once in 4 years. It was the most frightening thought she had ever had. "I'm not crazy," she said to herself. Not out loud, in the quiet underneath everything. "I know what I saw." Nora Caldwell appeared at her elbow. 40 years old, the estate manager, quiet and efficient, someone who had worked this house for 11 years and had therefore known Meg far better than Caroline ever would. She brought a chair and set it near the fireplace, without a word. "You've been on your feet too long," she said quietly. The simple kindness of it made Caroline's eyes sting. She sat down. Thomas found her near the window some time later. He was holding a glass of water he wasn't drinking. He looked worse up close, the skin around his eyes raw and tired. "She talked about you," he said. Caroline looked at him. "Meg did?" She said. He stopped. He looked at the floor and then back at her. "She said she hoped you knew what you were in." The words landed and stayed. Caroline opened her mouth. She found nothing to say. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and he looked as though he meant it for several different reasons at once. "Today isn't the right day. I just wanted you to know she thought about you." He moved away. Caroline stood at the window. Outside, the winter garden was bare. The rose bushes were dark, twisted shapes against the pale January ground. Meg had planted them, presumably. 31 years of roses, and Meg was in a casket at the front of St. Clement's Episcopal Church, and Elliot was across the room, being charming, and Caroline was standing at the window, holding sparkling water, and turning over the phrase, "She hoped you knew what you were in." She went upstairs eventually. She found the bathroom at the end of the hall, and she locked the door, and she sat on the edge of the tub with her shoes off. The porcelain was cold against the backs of her thighs. Her feet ached. She had been standing for 2 hours, and her ankles were swollen, and her lower back had its familiar low-grade complaint. The sounds of the reception filtered up from below. The low rumble of voices. Someone below laughed, and it was the wrong pitch. Too light, too easy. The laugh of someone who was not thinking about the woman whose house this was. Caroline sat on the edge of the bathtub with her shoes off and her hands in her lap, and she breathed. She did not cry. She was not ready to cry yet. She was doing something more important, something that required stillness and silence and the particular focus of a person who has just seen something they cannot unsee and is deciding, carefully and deliberately, what to do next. She sat there for a long time. When she came back downstairs, Elliot was ready to leave. He helped her with her coat. He held the car door. He asked twice on the drive home whether she was feeling all right. "I'm tired," she said each time. "Of course you are," he said. "I told you it would be too much." She looked out the passenger window and said nothing. She was not tired. She was wide awake. She was the most awake she had been in months. 3 days after the funeral, Caroline started paying attention. This was a decision. She made it consciously, sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her second cup of decaf going cold beside her. She made it the way she might decide to read a contract she had been handed. Carefully. From the beginning, without skipping anything, she started with his phone, not by taking it. Elliot kept his phone cloaked the way someone keeps a thing they need to control. She started simply by watching. The way he angled the screen when she walked into a room. The way he had started taking calls in the driveway, sitting in his car with the engine idling, coming inside 5 minutes after she heard the door of the car close. The way his eyes moved to his phone and then deliberately away from it when she was nearby. The careful performance of not checking. She had noticed these things before. She had explained them. He was busy. He was managing a public crisis at the company. He had always been private about work communications. She had been so good at explaining things. He told me not to come to the funeral, she thought. He knew she would be there. He had to have known. And then she thought, or he didn't think about me at all. He didn't consider me enough to worry about what I might see. She turned both thoughts over. She could not decide which one was worse. The chapter of her marriage she had been living in, she understood now, was a chapter with a central organizing fact she had not known. Every memory she had of the last 2 years was now like a photograph taken in bad light. The outlines were the same, but the meaning had shifted. Their first date. The way he had leaned across the table and said she was unlike anyone he had met in years. And as how she had thought it was a line and then decided it was real. She had decided it was real because she wanted to. Because she was 27 and he was 44 and charming, and he looked at her as if she were the most interesting thing in the room. "You make me feel like the best version of myself," he had said on their third date. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about that sentence. She had kept that sentence like a small, warm thing, taken it out and held it occasionally the way you hold something you love. She had thought it meant something true about her, about who she was to him. God, I was so stupid, she thought. Not because I fell for it, because I was so eager to believe I was special that I never once asked what made me special. Was it me? Or was it just that I was new? She was thinking about this on Thursday when Sylvie arrived. Sylvie Monroe knocked twice and then let herself in with the spare key she had been carrying for 3 years. She was 33 and red-haired and carrying a paper bag from the tie place on Clement Street and a look on her face that Caroline recognized as the look Sylvie wore when she was carrying something difficult. "I brought food," Sylvie said. "Thank you," Caroline said. "And something else." Sylvie set the bag down on the counter and stood with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at Caroline with an expression that was equal parts determination and guilt. "I need to show you something, and I need you to know I've been going back and forth about this for a long time, and I'm sorry it's taken me this long." She took out her phone. She held it out. Caroline looked at the screen. It was a screenshot of a photograph. Posted and then deleted, Sylvie explained quietly, by someone at Ashworth Industries who had thought it was private and then thought better of it. Sylvie had screenshotted it in the minute between posting and deletion. The photograph was of Elliot and Pamela, a restaurant, candlelight and wine and the particular angle of 2 bodies across a small table. Not a work dinner. The angle was wrong for a work dinner. The hands were wrong. Everything was wrong. The date stamp in the corner of the post read, 14 months ago. Caroline looked at the date for a long time. 14 months ago, she had been 3 months pregnant. She had been so exhausted, She was sleeping 10 and 11 hours a night and waking up still tired. She had given up coffee. She had given up soft cheese and deli meat and certain kinds of fish. She had been doing all the careful, effortful, unglamorous work of growing a human being. And Elliot had been at a candlelit dinner with Pamela Voss. She held the phone. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car moved slowly through the rain. "How long have you known?" she asked. The pause before Sylvie answered told her everything. "I suspected," Sylvie said, "for about 8 months. I didn't have proof, and I kept telling myself I was wrong, that I was being paranoid, that it wasn't my place. God, Caroline? I know that's not good enough. I know." Caroline set the phone down on the table. She stood up. She was not sure why she stood up. She walked to the pantry. She opened the pantry door, and she looked at the shelves, and then she began to take things down. Cans and boxes and jars. She turned them all label forward. She started alphabetizing. Artichoke hearts, black beans, chicken broth. She did this for 40 minutes without speaking. Sylvie sat at the kitchen table and let her. When Caroline finally stopped, she was holding a box of pasta and looking at it without seeing it. Sylvie stood up gently and took the box from her hands and put it on the shelf. "Come sit down," Sylvie said. Caroline sat down. She pulled a legal pad from the junk drawer and a pen. She wrote Elliot's name at the top. She wrote the date of the photograph. She wrote the date she had told him she was pregnant, and the date of their last vacation, and the date of the business trip to Dallas that had ended one day earlier than he said it had. She wrote the name Pamela Voss, and she wrote the title Funeral, and she wrote the phrase, "He told me not to come." She wrote for a long time. Her handwriting got smaller and more precise as the list grew, as if compression were a form of control. "The hardest part is admitting I knew all along," she thought. "I didn't want to know. That is different. But I knew." 5 days after the funeral, Diane Whitfield called. Caroline did not know the name. She answered because she answered most calls now, since she had started paying attention, since she had decided to know things. "Mrs. Ashworth," the woman said, "my name is Diane Whitfield. I was Margaret Ashworth's personal attorney. I've been thinking about whether to call you for several days. I've decided I owe it to Margaret's memory to try." They met at Diane's personal office, a smaller practice, separate from the firm that handled Elliot's corporate matters. Diane was 58, silver-haired, and wore reading glasses on a chain. Her office had framed botanical prints on the walls and the quality of a place where difficult things were said as carefully and clearly as possible. She looked at Caroline with an expression that was not quite sympathy. It was something more precise than that. It was the expression of a person who has been holding information and has made a decision about what to do with it. "Margaret knew about Pamela Voss for 2 years," Diane said without preamble. "She knew before the formal separation. She chose not to act immediately for reasons that were her own, but before she died, she left instructions. She placed a manila folder on the desk between them. She left something for you specifically. Not through the estate. This is entirely separate from the estate. She funded it from a personal account Elliot had no knowledge of." Caroline looked at the folder. She did not touch it. "Why?" she said. "She didn't know me." "She knew more about you than you might think," Diane said. "She watched you for 2 years," she said. Diane paused, looking down at her notes. She said, "The girl thinks she won something. She needs to understand what she actually walked into." The folder contained 4 things: a letter, handwritten on cream-colored paper, a set of financial documents spanning 7 years of Elliot's corporate and personal accounts, annotated in Meg's neat handwriting, contact information for a financial advisor named Robert Graves, who had worked with Meg privately, and a photograph, slightly older than Sylvie's screenshot, showing Elliot and Pamela together at what appeared to be a private event 3 years prior, before the separation. Caroline read the letter slowly. It was 2 pages, front and back, in the careful cursive of someone who had written in it many times before committing it to this final copy. "He will tell you it's your fault," Meg had written. "He told me that for 30 years. He is very convincing. You are probably smarter than I was at your age, but being smart doesn't protect you from a man who knows exactly which doubts to water. He is not a monster. That is the thing that makes it so confusing. There are real moments, there is real warmth sometimes, but the warmth is in service of something else. It is weather, not climate. Do not mistake it for the whole of him. I am not writing this to hurt you. I am writing this because I had no one to tell me, and I spent 31 years learning things I could have known in 5. If this letter reaches you in time, something will have been salvaged. That is enough for me." Caroline's baby kicked. Hard. She put her hand on her stomach automatically, the way she always did, that instinctive reaching for the small life pressing back. "She knew I was pregnant?" Caroline said. "She knew," Diane said quietly. Caroline sat with that for a moment. A woman she had never met, dying of cancer, knowing about her pregnancy, thinking about her, writing a letter. She drove home the long way. She took the river road, which added 20 minutes, and then she drove past the pharmacy on Birch Street and pulled into the parking lot and turned the engine off. She sat there. A woman came out of the pharmacy, pushing a stroller with one hand and holding a prescription bag with the other. An old man in a wool coat moved slowly toward the entrance, taking his time. A teenager sat on the curb looking at his phone. Normal Thursday things. Caroline sat in the parking lot for 23 minutes by the clock on the dashboard. She did not go in. She did not go home. She sat and she looked at the pharmacy and the people moving in and out of it, and she thought about the woman who had been in this marriage before her, who had learned everything slowly and painfully over 31 years, and who had decided at the end of her life that the one useful thing she could do was leave a map. She thought about pretending she hadn't seen the folder. She thought about putting it in a drawer. She thought about all the ways she had explained things before, all the small compressions she had made, all the space she had taken from herself to give to the story she wanted to believe. That night, when Elliot came to bed at 11, Caroline was already lying down with her eyes closed. She listened to him move through the room, the bathroom, the closet, the weight of him settling into the bed beside her. She lay completely still. She breathed slowly and deliberately. He fell asleep in 4 minutes, the way he always did. She lay in the dark for 3 hours with her hand on her stomach. At 2:30 in the morning, her phone lit up on the nightstand. She reached for it carefully, not waking him. A text from an unknown number that introduced itself in 2 sentences as Thomas Ashworth. "Can we talk?" "Not about the estate, about something she left for you that Diane doesn't know about." Thomas Ashworth lived in an apartment on the north side of the city, 20 minutes from the estate where he had grown up. It was a modest place for the son of a billionaire, deliberately modest, Carolyn understood. The choice of someone who had decided to build a life at a specific distance from his father's money. She met him on a Saturday morning while Elliot was at the office. Thomas was 26 and grieving and furious, and the combination made him seem both younger and older than his actual age. He made coffee she did not drink and sat across from her at a small kitchen table and put a box between them. Inside the box was a USB drive. She recorded voice memos, he said, on her phone for the last 11 years of the marriage. She kept a journal before that, but she switched to audio when the writing got difficult. She started doing it because she wanted a record, she said, in case she needed one, and then she kept doing it because it helped her. He looked at the drive and then at Caroline. She knew the legal documents, Diane, has would help you handle the practical things, but she said you'd need this for the other thing, knowing who he actually is. She said documentation tells you what happened, but the voice memos tell you how it felt. Carolyn took the drive home. She sat in her car in the garage with the door down, and she plugged the drive into her laptop, and she opened the first file. Meg's voice was dry and unhurried. It had the slight breathiness of someone speaking quietly, privately, without an audience. She talked about Elliot, the way a scientist might document a recurring natural phenomenon, with accuracy and with very little remaining surprise. This is the third time this month he has told me I am remembering something incorrectly, Meg said, in the first recording. It was dated 9 years ago. I am not misremembering. I know what I heard, but I have noticed that when I push back, he does not become louder. He becomes quieter and more certain, and I find myself wondering whether I am the unreliable one. I am beginning to understand that this is the point. Caroline listened to 4 recordings before she had to stop. She sat in the garage with the laptop open and the recording paused and her hands in her lap, and she thought about all the times she had wondered whether she was the unreliable one. The appointment with Dr. Preston Hayward was the following Tuesday, 32 weeks, routine. She had been going to Preston's practice since before the pregnancy, and he was thorough and kind and had the manner of a man who had been delivering difficult information for 30 years and had learned to do it gently. Today he was very careful. That was what she noticed first. The particular carefulness of someone who has found something unexpected and is trying to decide the least harmful way to present it. I need to show you something, Bay, he said. I should have caught this earlier and I didn't, and I apologize for that. He turned the tablet toward her. It was the insurance and emergency contact form for her prenatal care. Standard paperwork, filed 6 months ago. The emergency contact field read, Pamela Voss. Caroline looked at the name for a long time. Pamela Voss. Not Caroline's mother, not Sylvie, not anyone from Caroline's life. Pamela Voss. Elliot had updated the form 6 months ago. 3 months into Caroline's pregnancy, without telling her, he had listed his mistress as the person to call if something went wrong during her prenatal care. He replaced me, she thought. He replaced me on the paperwork before he even told me there was a reason to. She thanked Dr. Hayward. She gathered her things. She walked to her car in the parking structure, and she sat in the driver's seat, and she looked at the concrete pillar in front of her. I deserved better than this, she thought, not as a question and not as a wish, as a simple, declarative fact. I am sitting here, 7 months pregnant, and I deserved better than this. She drove home without the radio. The city moved past her windows in its ordinary way. Traffic lights and coffee shops, and a woman walking a dog, and 2 men arguing cheerfully outside a hardware store, all of it ordinary and indifferent. And she sat inside the moving car and felt her life divide. There was the before, and now there was after, and she was driving through the seam between them. She called her mother from the driveway. Ruth Hargrove answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm and easy, and then, within 3 seconds, it became very quiet. This was a skill of Ruth's that Caroline had been grateful for all her life, the ability to hear something coming before it arrived and to prepare herself. Mom, Caroline said, I need to tell you some things. I need you to let me finish before you say anything. All right, baby, Ruth said. Caroline talked for a long time. The funeral, Pamela's laugh and Des Elliott's hand on her arm, Sylvie's screenshot, and what the date stamp meant. Diane's office and the folder, and Meg's letter and the voice memos on the USB drive, the insurance form with Pamela Voss's name in the emergency contact field. She told all of it. She did not edit it. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. She could hear her mother breathing on the other end of the line, steadying herself. "When are you coming home?" Ruth said. She did not sleep well for 10 days. Not the ordinary pregnancy insomnia of a body too large and too uncomfortable to rest properly. This was a different kind of sleeplessness, the kind that lives behind the eyes and has nothing to do with the position of your pillow. It was the sleeplessness of a person carrying two simultaneous lives and the weight of keeping them separated. The surface life, tired but warm, solicitous, asking careful questions, and revealing nothing. Agreeing that, yes, she was tired. Yes, the last weeks of pregnancy were hard. Yes, she would rest more. Making dinner, answering when spoken to, performing, with reasonable skill, the role of a woman who did not know what she knew. The underground life, listening to Meg's voice memos in her car at 1 and 2 in the morning, adding to the legal pad, reading the financial documents Diane had provided, watching Elliot with the careful attention of someone cataloging rather than experiencing. By week 32, Dr. Hayward noted elevated blood pressure. The baby was fine. He said the word stress in a very neutral way, in the professional manner of someone who has decided not to pursue that thread but wants it noted. She was eating too little. She could feel it. She had no appetite, which was its own strange thing, because she had been hungry every single day of this pregnancy until the funeral. The night Elliot left for a 2-day trip to San Francisco, he said, a board meeting, Caroline sat on the bathroom floor. She had not planned to sit on the bathroom floor. She had been brushing her teeth, and she had looked at herself in the mirror, and something in the looking had just run out. She sat down on the tile, with her back against the cool porcelain of the tub, and her legs out in front of her, and she sat there. She did not cry for a long time, and then she did. It was not a graceful cry. It was not the kind of crying that looks good or feels cathartic or arrives with any sense of release. It was an ugly, gasping, wrecked kind of crying that had been compressing for 10 days in her chest, and that came out now sounding almost angry because it partly was. She was angry. She was also terrified. She was also, underneath both of those things, deeply sad in a way she had not expected. Not sad for herself, exactly. She would be sad for herself later, she understood. She was sad for the person she had been 18 months ago, standing in this same bathroom, different circumstances, crying then too, but in an entirely different way. She had stood in front of this mirror, holding a positive pregnancy test, and cried from joy, actual, uncomplicated joy, and she had taken a photo to show Elliot, and she had been so certain, so completely certain, that she had built something real. He never loved me, she thought. Not the way I thought, not actually. He loved the idea of me, young and uncomplicated, and not asking questions yet, not Meg with her 31 years of accumulated evidence. He loved who I was in the absence of knowledge. She sat on the bathroom floor, and she let herself be wrecked for a while, and when the crying finished, she sat there some more. At 1 in the morning, she went to the kitchen and made her grandmother's cornbread. She did not know why. She did not question it. She mixed the batter and poured it into the cast iron pan she had bought at the farmer's market 2 summers ago, and she put it in the oven, and she sat at the kitchen table and listened to it bake. The smell of it filled the kitchen. Butter and cornmeal, and the slight sweet char of the edges. She ate it warm, straight from the pan, sitting at the kitchen table, with the rain coming down outside the window. It tasted like something honest. At 2 in the morning, She was in bed with her phone, scrolling back through her camera roll. She was not sure what she was looking for. Evidence of something. Proof that happiness had been real, or proof that she had been deceived throughout, or some third thing she couldn't name. She found a video from 6 months ago. Elliot, reading on the couch on a Sunday afternoon, laughing suddenly at something in his book, shaking his head a little. She had filmed it because she liked the way he looked when he forgot to perform, when he was just a person reading a book and finding it funny. She watched the video 3 times. She put the phone face down on the nightstand. 3 days later, Sylvie called from a hotel room in Atlanta. She appeared on the video screen in the bathroom of her hotel, sitting on the edge of the tub, still in her work clothes, eating chips from the minibar. "I have 20 minutes before my next call," she said, "and I am using all 20 of them to sit here with you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." "What do you need tomorrow?" "Specifically. Not in general. Specifically." Caroline looked at the ceiling of her bedroom. "I need to call the attorney Diane recommended," she said. "Helen Marsh. I've been putting it off." "Why?" "Because once I call her, it's real." "It's already real," Sylvie said, not unkindly. "You calling her just makes it something you're handling instead of something that's happening to you." She was right. This was one of the things about Sylvie that Caroline had counted on for 9 years. "You are not doing this alone," Sylvie said. "Say it back to me." "I'm not doing this alone." Again. "Sylvie, again. I'm not doing this alone." "Correct. Call Helen Marsh tomorrow morning. I'll call you at 9 to make sure you've done it." Later, she stood in the doorway of the nursery. She had not been in this room in a week. The walls were sage green, the color she had spent 3 weeks choosing, comparing swatches and different lights. The crib was assembled. The bookshelf had 12 books arranged by size. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. "I built this," she thought. Whatever he was doing, whatever was happening, I was here. I was building this. Starting over feels impossible, she thought, but staying feels worse. And this baby is going to have a mother who chose herself. I am going to make sure of that. Helen Marsh had been a family law attorney for 33 years. She was 61, with short gray hair and an office decorated in practical neutral tones. The decor of a person who understood that the people sitting across from her were often in the worst period of their lives and did not need to be distracted by her taste in art. She reviewed what Caroline had brought: the financial documents from Diane, Sylvie's screenshot, Dr. Hayward's statement regarding the insurance filing, the annotated account records. She reviewed everything without comment, reading with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned to read quickly and understand completely. "The emergency contact filing alone," Helen said when she looked up, "is a meaningful indicator of intent. It demonstrates a deliberate action taken without your knowledge or consent during your prenatal care. Combined with the financial pattern Diane has documented and what you've gathered yourself, you are in a strong position." She paused. "You're 34 weeks pregnant. You have approximately 7 weeks before the baby arrives, probably fewer. I want to recommend we move before the birth. Not for legal reasons alone. Practically, a newborn changes every negotiating dynamic. He will have something to use. Right now you have clarity and momentum. I'd like to use them." Caroline thought about that on the drive home. She thought about the version of herself that had been sitting in the back pew of St. Clement's Episcopal Church 2 weeks ago, the version that had not known what she knew now. And she felt a strange, complicated tenderness for that woman in the dress she couldn't button. She had not been foolish. She had been trusting. Those were not the same thing. She began, in those days, to practice sentences, not argument. She understood by now that arguing with Elliot was not something she could win. He was better at it than she was. He had more practice and more patience for it, and a fundamental willingness to rewrite reality in the middle of a conversation that made standing your ground like trying to stand on water. So she practiced statements instead, short ones, sentences that did not require his agreement to be true. I know what I saw. She said it to herself in the shower. I know what the documents show. In the car. I know what Meg documented. Walking from the bedroom to the kitchen. I am leaving. In the mirror, in the morning, she opened a bank account at a branch on the west side that Elliot had no reason to use. She deposited 3 months of income from her freelance design work, money she had been earning independently since before the marriage, and that was unambiguously hers. She called her mother and gave her a specific date. I need to be there by week 36, she said. Can you have the room ready? It's been ready since last week, Ruth said simply. She texted Thomas. Thank you for the drive, she wrote. She was brave to document all of that. So were you for giving it to me, he replied in 20 minutes. She was the bravest person I knew. I'm glad it's helping. She sorted through her closet at midnight on a Wednesday, not frantically, not in the frantic rearranging the pantry way of 3 weeks ago. Methodically, she separated what was hers from what had been purchased with his money. The distinction mattered to her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. It was about knowing what was actually hers, knowing the boundaries of herself. The confrontation did not come the way she had planned it. She had imagined she would choose the moment. She would have everything ready, the words practiced, the documentation organized, Helen Marsh's number saved in her phone. What actually happened was a Wednesday afternoon. Elliot came home from the office early. She was in the kitchen on her phone, standing at the counter. She was talking to Helen Marsh about a timeline question. She heard the front door and kept talking, because she had not yet learned the right moment to stop. And by the time she registered that the footsteps had stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, she had already said Helen's name. She turned around. Elliot stood in the kitchen doorway, in his coat, holding his briefcase, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. She ended the call. That was Helen Marsh, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. There was a silence. Whatever you think you've found, he said, it isn't what it looks like. She had expected this. She had practiced her response to this. I know about the insurance form, she said. I know about the photograph from 14 months ago. I know about Dallas. I know what Meg documented. His face changed. Several things moved across it in sequence. Pamela is a colleague, he said. You're heavily pregnant and under significant stress, and you've been talking to people who are not acting in your interest. Pamela is a colleague, she repeated. That's what you're going with. After everything I've done for you, he said, and his voice shifted in a way she recognized now. Lower and more certain. The voice of someone who has decided to make you feel unreasonable. You are going to do this now. Now. 7 weeks before our child is born. I'm not asking you to admit anything tonight, she said. She kept her voice even. She had practiced keeping her voice even. I'm telling you that I know, and that I have retained counsel, and that I'll be staying at my mother's starting next week. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the expressions moving behind his eyes. She could see him cycling through his options. She had watched him work rooms full of people for 2 years, and she recognized the calculation now for exactly what it was. You're making a mistake, he said finally. No borrowing you shall, Caroline said. I made a mistake. I'm correcting it. She drove to the pharmacy afterward. She had no specific reason to go to the pharmacy. She drove there and parked in the lot and sat for a while. Then she went in. She bought sparkling water. She bought crackers. She bought the expensive lavender lotion she had been telling herself for 4 months was not worth the price. She drove home. She used the lotion. It smelled like something good, like something that belonged to her. Ruth Hargrove's house was small. This was the first thing Caroline thought when she arrived on a Thursday evening with 2 suitcases and her laptop bag and the box of Meg's documents and the USB drive. The house was small and warm, and it smelled like coffee and the cedar sachet Ruth had kept in the hall closet for as long as Caroline could remember, a smell that belonged absolutely and only to the specific feeling of being safe. Her old room was a craft room now. Fabric samples on a table, a sewing machine in the corner, bins of yarn, but there was a bed with clean sheets and a small table beside it with a lamp and a glass of water and a paperback novel that was entirely wrong for Caroline's tastes and exactly right for the gesture. She slept 11 hours. She woke up in her mother's house at 8 in the morning, and the light came through the window at the particular angle of a winter morning, and she lay still for a moment and simply breathed. She had not slept properly in 3 weeks. She had forgotten what the absence of dread felt like. She lay in the bed in her mother's craft room and breathed and thought, with great simplicity, this is a good morning. Helen Marsh and Diane Whitfield were in communication now, working in parallel on the legal proceedings Caroline had formally initiated. Helen had been right about the financial documentation. Meg had been meticulous, decades of meticulous. She had documented the specific patterns Elliot used across both marriages, the methods of asset reclassification, the way money moved between entities in ways designed to minimize apparent net worth during legal scrutiny. She had not used any of it in her own divorce proceedings. She had been too tired by then, Diane explained. Too ill, too depleted, too close to the end. She had gathered it all, and she had held it, and she had decided it was not for her. It was for whoever came after. Caroline sat with this on a morning in Ruth's kitchen, both hands around a mug of decaf, thinking about a woman she had never met who had spent her dying months organizing evidence for a stranger. She did this for a woman she had never met, she thought. Out of what? Solidarity? The rage of 31 wasted years needing somewhere to go? Something that might simply be called love. The specific love of one woman for another she would never know, connected only by the fact of having loved the same man and having learned the same things the hard way. She thought about Meg at 70, sick, knowing the time was limited, sitting in some room of that house, speaking quietly into her phone, recording her 11th year of observations for an archive she was building for someone she could only describe and hope for. It reached me, Caroline thought. It reached me in time. Somewhere along the way, she became invisible, Caroline thought. She documented everything because that was the only way to make herself real to herself again. I was letting that happen to me too. 5 more years, and I would have started making my own archive. The evening scene with Ruth happened on a Saturday, over decaf for Caroline and actual coffee for Ruth, who had made her position on decaf clear years ago and saw no reason to revise it. Ruth had been careful these past days, careful and present and not pushing. She had given Caroline space, and she had made meals, and she had not once said anything that began with the words, "I told you so," even though she had told her so, in her way, from the beginning. Now she set her cup down, and she looked at her daughter, and she said what she had been holding. "I never told you this," Ruth said. "The first time I met him, I drove home from that dinner, and I cried." Caroline looked at her. "Not sad crying," Ruth said. "Scared crying. Something about the way he talked over you twice, and both times you adjusted what you were saying to fit what he'd already said, and you didn't even seem to notice. I tried to tell myself I was being an overprotective mother. I told myself you were happy and smart and you'd figure out whatever you needed to figure out. Mom, let me finish. I should have said it. I'm not saying it would have changed anything because I know you, and I know you had to learn it yourself. But I'm sorry I let you walk in there without knowing I was scared. Carolyn reached across the table and took her mother's hand. I knew, she said. I think I knew you knew. I just didn't want to know that you knew. Ruth turned her hand over and held her daughter's. They sat like that for a while. In the garden the next morning, Caroline sat on the old porch bench in one of Ruth's oversized cardigans. 35 weeks. The garden was bare, winter stripped, but the bird feeder was full, and a cardinal had found it, a small red intensity against the gray morning, then a sparrow, then two. The morning was very quiet. Diane called mid-morning with news about the proceedings, confirmation of something they had already prepared for, the kind of news that closes a door rather than opens one. After she hung up, Caroline sat in the morning quiet for a while. She put her hand on her stomach. Here's what I know, she said quietly, not to herself, to the baby. Your father is complicated, and I am sorry for that, and someday you will decide for yourself what to do with that. But you are going to be born into a life that is honest. I can promise you that. I can absolutely promise you that. 3 weeks later, Caroline was 38 weeks pregnant, and the divorce proceedings had formally begun. She was at her mother's house, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and a cup of tea when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered because she answered most calls now. That habit had not left her. Mrs. Ashworth, the voice said. This is Pamela Voss. A silence. Caroline set down her cup. I want you to know, Pamela said, that I almost didn't call. I've picked up the phone 4 times and put it down. I'm calling because I think I owe it to you, and because I think you deserve to know a few things from me directly. All right, Caroline said. I did not know about the pregnancy, Pamela said. Not until 4 months ago. He told me your marriage was an arrangement, a business partnership, his word. He said you'd agreed mutually and that it was a marriage of mutual convenience, that you both understood what it was. He said there was no deception involved because there was nothing to deceive. Caroline closed her eyes. And you believed him, she said. I believed him, Pamela said. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm calling because Diane reached out to explain what Margaret left you, and I want you to know that some of what Meg gathered involves me directly, and I consent to your using it, that all of it, whatever helps your case. A pause. I was lied to, too, Pamela said. That doesn't change your situation. I know that. She stopped. I thought you should hear it. After the call ended, Caroline sat for a long time with the phone in her lap. She looked at the kitchen wall. She looked at the cardinal on the bird feeder outside the window. Then she laughed. It was not a happy laugh exactly. It was the laugh of something absurdist. The laugh of a situation that had become so layered and strange that it had crossed into a kind of dark comedy. The mistress was calling to offer testimony. The dead first wife had built a legal arsenal from her deathbed. The man at the center of it all had apparently told each woman a version of his life so tailored and convenient that none of them had the complete picture. She texted Sylvie, "The mistress just called to help me. You absolutely cannot make this up." Sylvie responded in 4 seconds. 7 question marks. Then a voice memo of 17 seconds that was entirely screaming. Caroline smiled. She put the phone down. She looked at the bird feeder. The mediation was on a Tuesday, 2 weeks before her due date. Helen had prepared her thoroughly, not for arguments, because arguments were not the point of a mediation, for presence, for the particular kind of stillness that communicates that you are not afraid and you are not going away and you have read every document in the binder you are carrying. Elliot arrived first. She saw him through the glass of the conference room door before she went in. He was in his best charcoal suit, the one he wore to presentations when he needed to be commanding. He was speaking quietly with his attorney, and he had the composed, assured bearing of a man who believes he knows how this meeting will go. He looked up when she entered. Something shifted in his face when he saw her. She was 38 weeks pregnant, walking carefully but steadily, carrying a binder, wearing the dark blue dress that Ruth had pressed for her that morning. She sat across from him and placed the binder on the table, and she looked at him directly. She had practiced this. Not what to say, how to look. Eyes level, posture open, not aggressive, not defensive, simply present in a way that communicated that she was entirely in possession of herself and everything she knew. The mediation moved through its stages, points of agreement and points of dispute. The careful negotiation of two people unbuilding a marriage with the assistance of professionals who did this every day and found the work still important. At one point, Elliot leaned forward and said, in the tone he used for things he expected to land heavily, "You're making this very difficult, Caroline." She looked at him. "Good," she said. One word, quietly, without heat, without triumph. Just a clear statement of fact. Something crossed his face that she had not seen before. Not calculation, not the practiced warmth, something smaller and more honest than either of those, something that surfaced briefly before he controlled it. She thought it might be the first genuinely true thing she had ever seen from him. The mediation concluded with terms that Helen had indicated were fair, and which Caroline understood to be as good as this kind of ending got. They were fair because she had documentation and witnesses and the testimony of a dead woman who had spent years preparing for exactly this. They were fair because Meg had decided, at the end of her life, that someone should be. Thomas was waiting outside on the sidewalk. He was in his winter coat, hands in his pockets, looking up at the sky in the way of a person who has been waiting a while and has made his peace with it. He looked at her face when she came through the door, and he apparently found sufficient information there. "My mother would have liked you," he said. "The you that you are right now." Caroline stood on the cold sidewalk and looked at this young man who had given her a USB drive in his apartment 3 months ago and changed the course of her life. "I think I would have liked her," she said, the her that she was at the end. They stood together for a moment. The city moved around them in its ordinary way. A bus, a woman walking fast with her coat pulled close, the smell of coffee from somewhere nearby. "I'll want to know my sibling," Thomas said. "If that's okay, eventually, when things are less raw." "That's okay," Caroline said. Eventually, she walked to her car. The sky was the particular pale blue of a cold February afternoon, sharp and clear. She drove back to her mother's house. She drove the speed limit. She took the bridge road because she had always liked the view of the river from the bridge in winter, the way the water was almost silver and the city spread along its banks. She thought about the phrase, "she's finally gone." She had been thinking about it since the funeral, turning it like something she'd found in her pocket, not sure what it was. She had heard it as an ending, as a door closing. She understood now that it was also a beginning. The baby came 6 days later. Ruth was there, beside the bed, holding Caroline's hand with both of hers. And she did not say anything when it mattered, and she said exactly the right things when words were needed. And this was the talent of Ruth Hargrove that Caroline had been counting on all her life. Sylvie arrived 20 minutes after, having driven 4 hours in weather that did not justify 4-hour drives, still wearing the clothes she'd had on the day before, having apparently left the moment she got the call. "I got here as fast as I could," she said, from the doorway of the hospital room, looking at the baby in Caroline's arms with an expression that moved rapidly through several stages of feeling before settling into something that looked like wonder. "You were 4 states away," Caroline said. "I got here as fast as I could," Sylvie said again. Thomas sent flowers, white roses. The card said simply, "Congratulations, you are both going to be remarkable." The baby was 7 pounds and 4 ounces. She had Caroline's mouth, the wide, soft shape of it, and eyes that were still the dark, undetermined blue of newborns, but would probably eventually show themselves to be something of Elliot's. That was a thought for later. That was a thought for when she had more sleep and more distance and the particular maturity that comes from having navigated the early weeks of a new life. She named the baby Margaret. She told her mother, before she told anyone else, lying in the hospital bed at 2 in the morning, with the baby sleeping in the bassinet and Ruth dozing in the chair by the window. "Margaret," Ruth said quietly from the chair, not quite asleep after all. "Margaret," Caroline confirmed. Ruth nodded once. She reached over and put her hand on Caroline's arm, and she didn't say anything else, and that was exactly right. She didn't tell most people the reason. Sylvie knew. Ruth knew. She wrote a short note to Diane Whitfield, handwritten on cream stationery, and sent it to her office. She thought Diane would understand what it meant. It felt like the right kind of private. Some things don't require explanation. Some things are just true. In the weeks after, Ruth's house became a different kind of space. It had always been warm and small and smelled like cedar and coffee. Now it was those things, and also the particular organized chaos of a newborn's presence, the bassinet in the kitchen, the small mountain of clean onesies on the dining room table, the specific exhaustion that was different from all the exhaustion before it because it had no dread in it. She was tired. She was the most tired she had ever been. She was also, underneath the tiredness, something she recognized after a few days as a kind of lightness, a relief so thorough it felt physical, like setting down something heavy after carrying it so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it. She slept without performing sleep. She woke at 3 in the morning when the baby needed feeding, and there was no dread in the waking, none of the held breath stillness of those nights in the other house, pretending to breathe slowly. There was just the ordinary darkness and the small sounds of Margaret needing something and the simple, clear purpose of providing it. She was 31 years old and recently divorced and a new mother, and she had approximately no idea what the next year looked like. This was true. She held it clearly without trying to explain it away. Also true, her daughter would know exactly who she was. Caroline would make sure of that. She was going to be a mother who had chosen herself, and her daughter would grow up knowing that choosing yourself was not selfish. It was the necessary ground from which everything else grew. A morning in Ruth's kitchen, 2 weeks after Margaret's birth. Ruth was making coffee. Margaret was asleep in the bassinet. They had moved into the kitchen because the company was good for everyone. The light was the gray gold of early February, that particular light that is not quite winter and not quite spring, but belongs entirely to itself. Caroline sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug that was mostly milk and a small amount of decaf, and she looked at the morning, and she thought, "This is mine," not in the grasping sense, not in the defended sense, simply, "This is mine, this morning, this kitchen, this light, this sleeping baby making the small regular sounds of a person deeply and thoroughly asleep. This is mine, and it is enough, and it is actually more than enough." She thought about the phrase, "she's finally gone." She had heard it first from across a church. Or she had imagined she heard it, or she had understood from a gesture and a laugh and a hand on an arm that it was being felt. That somewhere in the front of that church, on a day that was supposed to be about grief, someone was feeling the particular relief of a door finally closing. Margaret Ashworth, 72. dead of pancreatic cancer on a January morning. 2 years of illness, 31 years of marriage, 11 years of voice memos, recorded quietly in whatever room she happened to be in, building a careful archive of one woman's experience, of one man's reality, building it for someone she would never meet. She's finally gone. She had been so convinced, hearing it, that the gone was a loss, something subtracted, a woman reduced to absence. But Meg had been adding, not subtracting, all along. She had been adding documentation and clarity, and a letter in careful cursive, and a USB drive in a small box that her son had kept for exactly this. She had been adding herself to the record, her real self, the dry, precise, wry, occasionally devastated self that had been made invisible for decades and had refused, finally, to stay invisible. She was gone, and everything she had built in the leaving had changed Caroline's life. That is a remarkable kind of life, Caroline thought, to end it not in loss, but in gift, to spend your last energy not on grief, but on making sure the next person had something you didn't. She looked at her daughter in the bassinet. Margaret had her hand pressed to her cheek. She looked at 11 days old, like a person who had just thought of something and was considering whether to say it. You, Caroline thought, you are going to know who you are. I have been through something that has taught me exactly what matters and exactly what doesn't, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have that knowledge without having to earn it the way I did. She looked at the morning. She thought about the title, the way it had landed at first. In the back pew of St. Clement's Episcopal Church, like a stone dropped into still water, she's finally gone. The easy laugh, the hand on the arm, the relief of a man who believed he was finally free. She understood the title differently now. She was the one who was finally gone. She had walked out of that house and that marriage and that careful daily performance of being someone smaller than herself. She had walked out, and she had taken her daughter, and she had taken her name back, and she had taken the files that a dead woman had built for her. From pure, determined love, she had walked out. She was gone. I thought she's finally gone was about a dead woman, she thought. About a finished chapter, about the clearing away of something that stood between a man and what he wanted. But I'm the one who walked out. I'm the one who's gone. I walked out of that house and that marriage and that performance of someone else's idea of who I should be. Gone. Finally. The word settled in her chest and stayed there, not as an ending, not as a loss, as the truest, cleanest feeling she had had in years. Freedom. Ruth brought 2 mugs of coffee to the table. She set one in front of Caroline and took her own chair, the one by the window where the light was good. She was not a woman who needed to fill silence with words. She had never been that woman. This was one of the things Caroline loved most about her. They sat together. Margaret slept. The bird feeder in the garden was full, and a cardinal had found it the same way it found it every morning, small and red and precise against the pale February sky. The bare branches of Ruth's rose bushes were beginning to show the faint green suggestion of something new, the first tentative evidence of a season turning. It was too early for roses. They would not bloom for months. But the suggestion was there. The beginning of the thing that would become the thing. Caroline held her coffee with both hands and looked at her daughter and looked at the garden and felt the morning belong entirely to her, not to anyone else's schedule or preferences or carefully managed version of reality. To her, this morning, this kitchen, this light, this baby, sleeping with her hand pressed to her cheek like a small philosopher, this was what she had walked toward, not just away from something, toward this. Outside, a second cardinal joined the first. Ruth drank her coffee. The morning did its morning things. Closing disclaimer: the content of this story, including all characters, events, and emotional narratives, has been carefully researched, thoughtfully developed, and manually edited by our team. It is intended to entertain, inspire, and offer meaningful reflection. We hope it brought you something real.